And so you're going to see pictures. And so, as I said earlier, from CCMI, we had Barb and Jim Miller and Jim and Jill Gilliam and me. Our trip had 20 people on it with 3 people from the organization that we went with. So we went with an organization, and here's a picture of our whole group standing in front of Rosa Parks' apartment on our first day that we were there. We went with an organization called Museum Without Walls. Some of you have some familiarity with Suzanne Lacey, who came a few times in worship, and also was the organization that organized our Tulalip tribal visit last fall, if you were part of that. So she and 2 assistants were the organizers for this trip, and she puts together a lot of trips that have social justice underlying them. And one of her big things is to have us talk to people firsthand who have experienced whatever it is that we're studying. So when we went to the Tulalip tribal lands and we learned about the history of the boarding schools, some of you who were there remember that we heard from people who had actually been in Indian boarding schools. And so we had several of those experiences through this trip. And it was powerful, and it was one of the reasons that Kelly Brown, who's the lead pastor over at Plymouth Church, and I wanted to put this together with Suzanne, is that we know of her work and the power of these firsthand accounts. So you're going to hear about some of that today. Next slide. I'm going to start out by talking to you a little bit about Montgomery. We flew to Atlanta, and then we drove straight to Montgomery, which was pretty much our hub for the trip. And Montgomery is interesting. You're going to hear a little bit more about Selma. Montgomery, my impression of Montgomery is that it has an infusion of capital and life to it, partly because it has become the center of civil rights pilgrimage or civil rights trips. We saw a lot of tour buses while we were in Montgomery. There's, plenty of restaurants, plenty of things to do in Montgomery. And a lot we'll have to do. I'm going to be talking a little bit about Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative and the museums and legacy sites that he has in Montgomery. Thank God that is all privately funded, because he tells the history through these sites of the African American experience from the transatlantic slave trade through mass incarceration. And with our current administration, the funding for those things, as that just came down about the Smithsonian funding, has been taken away. So these are all privately funded sites. So they are not in any jeopardy in any way of changing or having to change their focus, any of that. So that's really good. All right, so on our first day, one of the places we went, one of the things we did was learn about the bus boycott, right? Montgomery's known for the Montgomery bus boycott. And we went to the place where that all started, which was Holt Street Baptist Church. It was where Martin Luther King, young Martin Luther King, I think he was, he was like 25 or something, was pushed into national prominence as the leader of the bus boycott. He was the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and so at Holt Street, they had this organizing meeting. So Rosa Parks doesn't get up from her seat. Jim's going to talk a little bit more about Rosa Parks, which was a planned thing. This was not just a lady who was a little bit tired, which is how I was taught in school. So they had to organize what they were going to do now. And they decided they're going to boycott the buses, which for the African American people in Montgomery was a huge thing because it was our primary form of transportation. It was really the only way they got around. Most of them did not have private cars. So through the churches, through the power of the local churches, they created a completely alternative transportation system, committed to it, and sustained it for over a year, where the African American folks would either walk when they could, or they would gather in parking lots, largely church parking lots. Churches used whatever vehicles they had or could borrow, and they created a whole alternative taxi system that changed, no money changed hands. They got each other around town for over a year. It was amazing to me. And it cost them dearly. So they risked it all is a picture of the churches that participated in that. This Holt Street, not Avenue, Holt Street, right? Baptist Church was in a thriving Black community in Montgomery. They organized, they were very effective. They broke the backs of the transportation system, and segregation on the buses ended. And for that, they paid by having a freeway come directly through their community. So right next to Holt Street, they have now moved where they meet. This is the old church. They use as kind of a museum piece. And they're at an intersection of two freeways, actually. So it's not just one freeway coming through. When the city planners located intentionally this freeway interchange to come in, which decimated the community. When we drove through there on our bus tour, most of the houses are boarded up. There's almost nothing there anymore. So we learned about that history, and that's what they risked it all. Dawn, you can give the next slide. This was there's a lot of these signs in Montgomery. And this was outside of our hotel. Our hotel was on Commerce Street. Commerce Street was an important street in the slave trade. Folks who were enslaved were brought up the river and then walked from Commerce, up Commerce Street, and there were warehouses all along the sides. And they were held in warehouses before they went to the auction block. And so I took a picture of this because it talks about the warehouses, and it says 122 Commerce Street was a big warehouse where those who were enslaved were brought before they were sold. The next slide. And now it's the headquarters for the Equal Justice Initiative. So there's a lot of this all around Montgomery where there's the history of what happened there, which the Equal Justice Initiative, do many of you know what that is? Do you know about Brian Stevenson, who wrote the book Just Mercy, and it was also a movie called Just Mercy? He's an attorney who has committed his life to defending people on death row. And he's also very committed to telling the history of the African American people. So he started this organization, the Equal Justice Initiative. They are still an organization of lawyers who are defending people accused of capital crimes. But he has created these 3 legacy sites: the Legacy Museum, the National Monument for Peace and Justice, which is known as the Lynching Memorial, if you've heard about that in Montgomery. And there's a sculpture park. And so you'll be hearing more about all of those places. But I love the irony of this slave warehouse now becoming the offices for justice work. And this was pretty much next door to our hotel. So everywhere you went, there's kind of the new, and then there's this history underneath. Go ahead, next slide. This is where the slave auction block was in Montgomery. It's kind of a roundabout that's several streets, and it was about 2 blocks from our hotel. And you never know it, right? It's a Grecian fountain. Except for if you see around the bottom, it says Black Lives Matter. There's a mural around. It's kind of a little bit faded around the outside of it. But we passed that quite a lot of times. Anytime we were walking around Montgomery, we were reminded that that's where a lot of that history happened. Okay, Dawn, you can. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Legacy Museum. This is in Montgomery, Alabama. It is one of the 3 legacy sites from the Equal Justice Initiative. This was the most impactful museum I've ever been in my entire life. I think one of Brian Stevenson's core values is proximity. He thinks you need to hear the stories and feel proximate to the stories, and that we as human beings will distance ourselves. And so I'll tell you a little bit about how proximity happens in this museum. Okay, Don. So I was telling you a little story about the warehouses, right? So when people who were enslaved, about 50% of them were separated from their families. So they'd be taken, separated, and put into cells like this to wait. And horrible things happened to them in those cells because people who were buying them would go in and inspect them. And so you can imagine, especially if you're female, what kind of inspection that might have been. I mean, it's horrors. But in the museum, you walk into a room where there's these cells along the sides. I don't know if you can see very well, but that's a hologram of an enslaved person who, as you walk up to it, will talk to you and will say, so there's one that had 2 small children in it saying, "Where's my mother? Can you help me find my mother?" And then a little one yelling, "Mama," which gives me chills just talking about it now. It brought me to tears. Then there was another one of a woman whose children had been taken saying, "Here are my children's names. Please help me find them." So you are faced with the horror of what happened in such a different way than if you're just walking up and reading about it or even looking at pictures. This was more of a visceral experience that you can't help but feel something with, right? As hard as it is, and it's hard, you couldn't help but feel for the horror. Everything in the Legacy Museum, I hope it doesn't sound like it's contrived, because it's not manipulative or contrived. It's all researched. I'm sure those were real people with real names, and that was their real transcript that they found somewhere, right? These are all very well-researched stories, but it puts you in a place where you're experiencing the horror of what happened in such a different way than I've experienced in other kinds of museums or other installations about this. Okay, Dawn, you can go. Another proximity at the very end, so he tells the story from the transatlantic slave trade in this museum and to mass incarceration, and connects what happens that connects all of those dots. So these are not unrelated things, right? That the history takes us all the way through. So this at the end was, those are videos of people who are clients of the Equal Justice Initiative and are imprisoned. And when you walk into this room, they're there close up blinking at you. So you go up and you sit there and you pick up the receiver, then they pick up the receiver and talk to you about their stories, about what it's like being incarcerated, and then they thank you for listening. So it puts you, again, it's a proximity thing. It really felt like you were visiting somebody in prison who was then telling a story. Even though it was one-sided, it didn't feel like it at all because of how close you are to those videos and how heartfelt they were, I would say. All right, Dawn, go ahead. So I don't know how many of you have heard about the jars. The other thing that the Equal Justice Initiative have done with the history of lynching is that they have collected soil from as many lynching sites as they possibly can across the country. And they know that there is so much more lynching than what's documented. But because those families don't have a way to memorialize their people, they do it. So at in the Legacy Museum, there are big walls of these jars, and each jar has the person's name on it and the date that they died. And it is the soil from around the tree where they were lynched, so which contains their DNA. So that was pretty powerful. This was actually at a different Equal Justice Initiative site where they had more jars. So they really are collecting jars. And there are videos throughout the museum because it's a really intense museum. So one of the things that offers relief to go and sit and watch a video for a little while. And one of them was about families who were collecting, or people who were collecting that soil. And it was very healing for them to be part of that, to be part of memorializing their family member in some way. So rows and rows of jars of dirt was also part of the museum. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Jill now. And we'll do questions at the end so we can get through what we want to say.
I'm realizing I don't want to sit with my back, talk with my back to people. So, I don't know, I haven't seen the pictures, so I'm not sure what they're going to show, but the things that struck me about this particular site, I guess, is it's acres. It's huge. It's not just a small thing. And I actually, because I knew there was a lynching memorial, and I knew we were going to something called the Memorial for Peace and Justice, but I didn't put it together initially that those were the same thing. So I didn't know this was about lynching at first. In fact, I got there and started walking in and then asked a staff person, is this the lynching memorial? And he said yes. So you see there's rectangles. Those are metal rectangles. And when you first come in, they're on the ground. And then it's, like I said, it's acres, and you can see we're looking up a hill. It's contoured to the hill, and then very gradually as you progress through, those rectangles come up off the ground, and by the time you get to the end of it, you're looking up and they're way over your head. So you cannot see. They're starting to be over your head. Each one is engraved. Well, each one, first of all, represents a county where lynchings have been documented. And then on each rectangle is the name and date, if they have a name. So sometimes I saw more than one, or at least one, that is an entire family. The father, the mother, 2 children lynched. And at the bottom, it lists that county. But it's counties through the entire country. It's not just the South. And so it becomes a little overwhelming. Do another slide and see what else. I'm not sure what I'm going to be looking at. That says, for the hanged and beaten, for the shot, drowned, and burned, for the tortured, tormented, and terrorized, for those abandoned by the rule of law, we will remember, with hope, because hopelessness is the enemy of justice, with courage, because peace requires bravery, with persistence, because justice is a constant struggle, and with faith, because we shall overcome. And coming on this trip, Jim and I had done some civil rights traveling. We drove the Great River Road from St. Paul past New Orleans, and we stopped primarily at Underground Railroad sites and Native American sites. And so I didn't learn a lot of factual things on this trip because I had read quite a bit and I knew a fair amount of the history. But what is so strikingly different, and what Jennifer was talking about, is the art with which these things were done. What hit you at a completely different level. It was such a gut level response of emotion as opposed to just the litany of facts. And this site was that way. Those hanging, you can see there the number of those rectangles, how many there were. And then the other thing is toward the end, after they were way up over your head, they're all repeated and they're laying down on the ground. And so then you can read all of them. And you can see how in some of those counties, I don't know how long those rectangles were, but they were covered with names in some counties. And others, there might just be one or two names. So it really varied. Next. So that was the last picture from the lynching memorial. And we did the Legacy Museum in the morning, and then we ate lunch, and then we went to the lynching memorial, and then after that we went to a sculpture park. And so it was a long and very emotionally taxing kind of a day. But this is a sculpture park, and I can't remember was that part of... It's called the Freedom Sculpture Park. It is part of the Legacy section. It's still part of it. Okay, yeah. Oh, I didn't realize that. Yeah, so it was brand new. But that sculpture that you just saw for one slide back that's how you arrive, and you come to see that, and it's right on the other side of a gate. But the gate is a huge sculpture that you walk through. But then those are the only pictures you can take. You can take a picture at the entrance and you can take a picture at the exit, but they don't allow photography anywhere in the middle. And once again, it goes on for acres, and it depicts different aspects of the history of the Black experience in America. So there's slave cabins there, but there's art all along the way, and the art is just amazing. And once again, it's one thing to know the facts, but somehow the art gives it an emotional response. So this is as you exit, and I don't know if you can see very well, but this is a person, and these are people. So that's how big that wall is. And it's big enough on one side, as you see, but the back of it is equally big. They're just huge plates, and that it looks like some kind of texture on that wall. It's names. And they did research and found every surname of an enslaved person that was ever recorded is on that wall. So it is rather staggering, the number of people, because it's not an individual but whole family names. And these are sculptured people standing back looking at that wall. So this was kind of a plaza, and it was one place we were able to take pictures. So there were no pictures otherwise. And so that was our first day. Those three things all in one day. We were pretty tired after that. And kind of wrung out, I think, is how I felt. The next morning we got up and traveled to Selma, and we were invited to the Tabernacle Baptist Church for morning worship. And the first speaker we heard was an African-American woman who's a representative from Alabama. She spoke. Then Hakeem Jeffries spoke. Then Raphael Warnock did the sermon. And he is an amazing speaker. It was and really it was a strange hybrid of a church service and a political event. Because they introduced every politically elected person there, and it was a long list. There were many names I didn't know, but one of the people, and I knew the names Hakeem Jeffries and Raphael Warnock, but I didn't really even have a face. I don't watch TV. I don't know what they look like. So I couldn't recognize them, but Jesse Jackson was there in a wheelchair, and I could still recognize him. And so it was, I couldn't count how many times the sermon was interrupted by clapping and cheering. It was very often. And then Al Sharpton finished off the speaking that morning. So it was, that church service was wonderful, and one of the things that struck me also was someone, I don't remember who was speaking. It wasn't the minister of the church. He did introduce people, but at some point, one of the speakers reminded us that this is a church, and the members of that church were not there that Sunday morning of the Jubilee of Bloody Sunday because they left room for us, for all of us tourists to be there, and we were not the only tour group there. So that really struck me that they opened their church in that way for us, especially when such renowned speakers were coming. It was very moving. And I think that's, go to the next, is that the end of the pictures? Okay, I don't know what's next. That's Barb's. Or Jim's. Jim's next.
That was wonderful. I'm going to try to do this in a different way. Originally was going to try to just walk us through what we did day by day, but then I realized actually I'd been awfully confused because I couldn't remember the order in which events had occurred, and I was walking through them in something that's got nothing to do with that. So this is sort of a brief history, courtesy mostly of Wikipedia and friends, of the civil rights movement. So I'm going to start it in 1863, which was the Emancipation Proclamation, which I thought freed all the slaves. Wrong, wrong, wrong. It freed precisely the slaves who were in states that were in rebellion during the Civil Rights War. So it didn't affect any of the states that had participated on the north side, where there were plenty of enslaved states, and it didn't involve any of the border states that the Union had taken over. So it only released the slaves in the Deep South, essentially. It was a very interesting political move. I mean, Lincoln was playing a very, very hard game, and this was one piece in it. Then, about 15 years later, 1877, is the end of Reconstruction. Another interesting political thing. There's something that, there's an informal agreement. It's actually never documented, it was never made a law, and it was never official, that compromised that the southern states would recognize the election of Rutherford Hayes, who had been elected, but I don't know exactly what the controversy over his election was, but it was questionable. And they agreed that if the U.S. would remove its troops from the South and stop the Reconstruction efforts, which were destroying a lot of the infrastructure of the South that were the remains of the slavery, then they'd go ahead and not challenge Hayes' election. So that's how we got an end to the, depends on whose side you're on, whether it was recovery efforts or destruction efforts, but anyway, efforts to change the society at the time. We'll skip forward to 1951, which is sort of the modern era there. That's when the Brown versus Education happens. Is that this is, we on a separate trip, Barb and I had been cycling, and on the trip back from there, we went through this area. And so this is Topeka, Kansas, and that's the school that was being integrated at the time. or what was segregated at the time. And so this is what started the Brown versus Education story, which ended at the Supreme Court in 1954. And that was the Supreme Court's unanimous ruling included the words, "Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal." So that ended across the United States, officially, segregated school systems. And we'll go on to a year after that, 1955. That's Rosa Parks. Now, yeah, next slide. That's her apartment at the time that she didn't release her seat on the bus. She lived there for only a few years. She had moved in there a few years earlier. She moved out shortly after that and went to Detroit. But it's the center point of a lot of the civil rights tours, and it's an official, I don't know whether this national park, it's some kind of official National Historic Site. And there's a very interesting history around the whole Montgomery issue around separated buses. Segregated busing in Montgomery, according to the sources I saw, started in 1900. So that's 55 years earlier. And it happened before it was implemented statewide. So Montgomery was actually the very first place where bus segregation started. So it had been going for 55 years. It was well established. It was a norm. There had been multiple arrests previous to this of people for violating those rules, all nonviolent, and they go back as far as 1946. And my reading of what they were saying the rules were, they're a lot less bad than you probably imagined they were, but they were not what people were doing. They were just the legal basis. It was actually pretty simple. It was like part of the bus is for blacks, part of the bus is not for blacks. And you can only be asked to move your seat if there's another seat available for you. So, but that's not how it worked. That's just what the rules were at the time. There's a lot of debate about exactly how organized her particular action was. And we went to the museum, the Rosa Parks Museum, which is really quite effective in the same way. It's one of those ones where you are right in the situation. And in fact, they have a bus there, a bus of the era, and they project onto it. And so you can watch the entire story play out. The other thing they mention in passing in that, but if you go on to Wikipedia, you will get it in depth. The particular bus driver was not a coincidence that was the one that it happened with. He had been arrested several times for going beyond what was allowed by those laws. And he was party to many of the previous suits about this, and he had been found guilty of violating the law. So it's quite deep. It is clear she was an officer in the NAACP, so she was deeply embedded in this. How much they organized that particular date, that particular time, that particular place is unclear. Her statement is it was not premeditated in that sense. She was prepared. She knew what she needed to do if she wanted to do it. But choice of what exactly had happened, she says, was completely up to her. And she happened to be very tired that day. And she just felt that was the time to make a stand by not standing, essentially. It turned into a mass boycott. And Martin Luther King came down then and was asked to organize that, which he did. The boycott, as you said, went for over a year, from December 5th, 1955 to December 20th, 1956. A couple things that are worth knowing is that bus company, it was a private bus company, their point of view in this whole thing is they're just enforcing the law. They've got nothing else to do with this. More than 50% of their ridership, I think it's 70% of their ridership, was black. So they knew this was going to be a financial issue, considerable issue. But they felt their hands were tied because they are required to obey the law. And that it's an interesting question. When is it right to violate the law and when isn't it? And do you expect humans to do that? Do you expect corporations to do that? All of that is very interesting. Martin Luther King is the one who personally was insistent that it all remain nonviolent. And he drew it not out of the Christian tradition, but from Gandhi. And Gandhi was in 1948, who comes out of the Hindu tradition, and so it was kind of an interesting blending of so many things, I thought, at that time. Let's go on to the next. So there's Rosa Parks herself. Now there's a whole set of statutes. As you will go through Montgomery, if you go through it the way we did, it's all about civil rights, and you see Rosa Parks everywhere. There happens to be another fact that you might or might not know. It also happens to be the capital of the state, but you wouldn't necessarily know that from in general. Another one, you can't tell from these pictures, she's about that tall. She's not a physically impressive person, but she certainly changed things. There's a specific memorial sign to the actual bus stop where she got on. I don't think there is one to where she got off, or maybe there is it's right in front of the museum. That's right. So the museum is at the spot where she was arrested, which was, about 4 blocks away. Let's take a next. There she is. I don't know where this particular, I think this is in the museum. Yeah. Of her sitting in a seat. Notice it is vacant. There's a reason why it's vacant. There had been someone there who had decided to move when asked. Okay, and this is now we're on to the next piece of this. So that was 1955. Jump ahead 6 years, 1961. We have the Freedom Rides, and this is the Freedom Rides Museum. It doesn't look like a museum. I mean, it wasn't a museum at the time. It was a bus station. And this was the bus station, and that is the actual bus station. And you can't quite see it, but there's a pathway that goes back in there. The bus station had 2 entrances. Guess why? And one of them is on this nice big street and enters right into a nice big lobby. And the other one goes down this little tiny alley and goes around a side entrance and doesn't have any, it has access to, but not particularly convenient access to, things like the restrooms and the food counters. It's an interstate bus. And interstate busing was controlled by a Supreme Court decision which made it not segregated, integrated. But that wasn't being particularly well handled. And it left interesting room for issues like, if you have a bus that comes to the state line and then you walk across the state line and get on the bus, is that an interstate bus or not? You certainly didn't take an interstate ride, but you were on an interstate bus. And so that was the first of the major movement pieces that were at the request, essentially, of the local black community. They asked people from outside who were not black to come and participate and lead. And so they brought these so-called Freedom Riders down from, I think Chicago was the, yeah, right. So that, and this was a fascinating, actually, I didn't have the slide there with the guy who spoke. The curator of the museum was there. The museum is actually being renovated, so we never got inside, but he told us everything you could possibly want to know about this. It was really quite impressive. Yes. Okay. So now we, I say we took a jump shift here. Oh, so that was. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So that the Freedom Riders and various other things that were going on led eventually in 1963 and 1965 to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which were essentially started under the Kennedy administration and kind of dumped in the lap of Lyndon Johnson. Kennedy had been dragging his feet because he didn't want to have another rebellion get started. Johnson basically took the attitude that, and he's a Southerner. I mean, he's a real deep Southerner. And he took a very courageous stand, I think, to basically say, we're doing this, it's got to get done, just do it. And so he was the one who made the decision to send troops into the Selma March later on. So we'll get to that in just a second. So 1965, so this is 10 years after the Rosa Parks incident. That's the march that was intended to be a march from Selma, 54 miles into Montgomery. And it was a 5-day march, and they had places they're staying and so forth and so on. They actually wound up, technically there are 3 marches. So there was one on March 7th when they started, and you'll see the bridge, you go up over the bridge, and the marchers came down the other side and saw the Alabama State Troopers there with tear gas and clubs, and decided they had best, well, there was a big melee. They turned back. Then, and yes, quite a number of people injured at that point. And that had about 800 people, according to what my sources say. And 2 days later, King joined, and they started, and a court order injunction temporarily enjoining the march had come, and King made the decision, we will not march. So they turned back a second time. And then on the 21st, Johnson sent in the U.S. National Guard to help protect the marchers from the troopers. And that was the one that succeeded, and they then marched on. And that's the Bloody Sunday. Oddly enough, by the way, now if you go look up Bloody Sunday, what do you find on the internet? You find the Irish Bloody Sunday, which was actually bloody, and people were seriously killed. The first one was several injuries, no deaths. The total on the final march, no one died on the march. 3 people died in related events to the march. When they finished the march, they had about 25,000 people assembled in the state, not all from the march, but from other places as well. So it was quite effective. Sorry, remind me again. I've forgotten what. That's right. Yeah. So yeah, and then this is also Selma. This is the other thing that is not the normal stuff you think about on a civil rights tour of Selma. That's a Confederate cemetery, a big, beautiful, large, still maintained Confederate cemetery. And I think the next slide is more. That is, in fact, described on the next slide. That's the Jefferson Davis chair. So that actually was the president of the Confederacy. So this really is a memorial to the Civil War in many ways. And not too far from this, there's a very small section of Selma that has beautiful, elegant homes, of course, of the white community there at the time. Next slide. Okay, so this is Selma. That is the bridge after all the marchers had left. And it's just nice, peaceful, simple bridge. It is going up a nice little slope there. And from this side, which is the Selma side, heading in towards Montgomery, It's actually very pleasant. It's a beautiful spot there, and the river is right below you. But you really can't see what's on the other side of that bridge, can you? So imagine what it'd be like to be marching over that and then come to the top of the rise. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is the last thing I'm going to show you. On the way back, we were in a bus and going back to Montgomery. And on the Bloody Sunday March, one of the deaths was this woman, Viola. What she was doing was going out and bringing people who wanted to go back from Montgomery to Selma and bringing them back. And I don't know, what was she? She was, yeah. So, yeah. But there's a big memorial to her. And so we stopped there. The plan was we were going to stop and look at the memorial, but there was already a group there unfurling a very, very large banner, which I don't think any of us got a picture of. And we were going to give them time to spend their time at the memorial and so forth, but that wasn't what they wanted. They wanted us to come up, and they kept saying, please come up, please come up. So we came up when we joined there. It was the Southern Leadership Conference. Their president was there. They lead a march. I think it's every 5 years. They do the whole 5-day recreation of the 5-day march, and this was day 3 for them. So we came up and sang "We Shall Overcome" with them, and it was an interesting way to end our trip back to Montgomery. I just wanted to add a couple thoughts that came to me sort of related to this. One is, I think you alluded to this earlier, that the previous trip had been to the Tulalip tribe here. If you think about the number of cultures that have gone through some kind of discriminatory action that is, patently unreasonable, immoral, unjustifiable in this country. Now I notice these as I go along. There's a regrettably large number of them, and one might say that they're continuing. It just seems to be inevitable. There is an absolute, quantum difference between most of those and the black experience. One of the issues there is the issue around slavery. This was all post-slavery. Everything I told you about here is post-slavery. But that slavery makes a huge difference. And that's the other thing at this time of year for me, as I'm Jewish, we're about to have Passover. So I was asking myself, so how long does that mark of slavery continue on in the culture that was enslaved? Well, the Jews were enslaved. If you believe here again, go do your research on this and come to your own conclusions. But what I found is that there seems to be some historical justification for an argument that if there was enslaved Jews building pyramids, they were doing that about 3,500 years ago. There's a lot of controversy about that. If you do it biblically, it's more like 6,000. If you do it archaeologically, it's more like 3,400. But what's been happening in those 3,400 years? Well, we don't really know. We do know that from the New Testament, there were Seders, which is a service that I'm going to talk about in a second, starting in the year 0, 2,000 years ago, and believed to be going for at least 1,000 years before that. So for 2,000 years, those enslaved people were following a biblical requirement to remember that. And that remembrance is a full week every year for at least 2,000 years that people have been remembering that. So that slavery goes a long time. The other thing, which is a challenge to you in the religious side of things, who remembers how the book of Exodus, which tells the story of that journey, how does it end? It ends by Moses going up Mount Sinai, going up to a tent where he's going to look down on the promised land, and he's not allowed through. And so when I was a little kid, what I was taught in Sunday school was that if you look at what was happening there, the slaves came out of Egypt. They wandered for 40 years in the desert. That was long enough for all the slaves to die, but not their children. So the only remaining slave was Moses. And God wanted a new country that was not tainted with slavery. So he didn't let Moses in. So let me end it there. Who's next?
Okay, so the part I'm going to talk about is pretty controversial, and the more I got interested in it, the more threads I pulled, the more complicated it got. But fortunately, because I have this cold, I'm not going to be able to tell you everything. You're just going to have to get little bits of it. But anyway, this guy here is J. Marion Sims, who is a doctor who everyone agrees that he developed a operation for a condition that occurs for women in childbirth. It's called a vesicovascular fistula. And this is all kind of gross. I'm not going to go into too much of it. But essentially, if the child is being born into a birth canal that is too small, which I believe, one of the people we're talking about was like 9 years old, so you can understand that. It can push a hole through the bladder. The fetus can't get out, it dies, and eventually it rots and comes out. And for the rest of the woman's life, she has no control over her urinary movements. So she can't work, there's just not much that you can do. So it doesn't kill her unless she gets infected, which is another possibility. But it's also, it's just a bad situation to be in. And, the doctors that I've talked to say, yeah, this was it. The fact that he did come up with an operation to fix that is a big deal. It has saved many lives since then, and it's really important. But I guess what we should do is, okay, so this is the statue of him that's on the state capitol grounds. There was one in Central Park in New York City that was put up by the one of Sims' disciples, and it got moved out after the Black Lives Matter. It's now in the cemetery where he's buried, and I'll go into the reasons for that and why he's so controversial in the next. We can look at the next slide. We visited a place called the Mothers of Gynecology Clinical Museum. Now, the Mothers of Gynecology, who are referred to here, are the slave women, teenaged women, who, there were about 12 of them that he experimented on to find a way to solve this problem. They were all slaves. This was in the 1840s, 1845 to 1849. They had the other thing you need to know is by this point the transatlantic slave trade had been outlawed, and there was a huge need for slaves in the South because the cotton gin had increased production of, you could now process a lot of cotton, so you needed to be able to grow it and pick it. So they needed to get slaves somewhere. So up north, where the tobacco crops were not as profitable as they had been, they would sell slaves down south. That was what the domestic slave trade was about. The thing at the beginning with the slave warehouses, they often had come from the north. New Orleans, Montgomery, Mobile, these were all places that were kind of centers for picking up your slaves that had been produced for you up north. So anyway, it was important. So how these girls got pregnant and had these babies, you can kind of guess. It was probably not their choice necessarily. So if we look at the next slide, her name is Michelle, and I forget her last name, but Browder, Michelle Browder. She has, this is her house that she's turning into this museum. And so we got up and we sat on the porch and got a little bit of a talk about it. By her. And then the next slide, looking down from the porch at the lot next door, which is where her artwork is, she felt that it was important that these slave girls be memorialized, because if Sims is the father of gynecology who did all this work on them without necessarily their consent, then they were mothers. There's only 3 of them who actually have names in his memoirs. That's the main source they have. The main historical source is what he says about it. There was Lucy, Anarcha, and Betsy. And then there were a bunch of others as well. So this is the artwork that Michelle was moved to make to memorialize these 3 women. And Anarcha is the one in the middle, the tallest. She was the one who had like 12 operations. I mean, he didn't know how to do it, so he had to just keep doing it. It was done. This was the thing that got me interested in researching this. It was done without anesthetic, which was considered, this is considered a horrible thing, and it was painful. They did have opium, but that wasn't controlling the thing. But I remembered thinking, well, when did anesthetic come into general use? And the fact is, it wasn't published until 1846. And at that point, there was still controversy around the fact that if you're basically knocking someone out. I mean, these days now, even if you have an operation, the anesthetic is one of the dangers of it. So the fact that he wasn't using it could have been his medical judgment that it was an unnecessary risk, or that it wasn't. But there was also the belief that African Americans didn't experience pain to the same degree, and there was also the question of, did they consent? Now, he had to get the legal consent of their owners in order to do this. His claim was that they did consent because if he said, I'm going to try and fix this problem that's bothering you, and they said, okay. But truthfully, they had no choice in this. They were, they didn't know what it was going to be. They just, they had to agree to it. And the other thing is that it was a theater. They were there, naked, kneeling down or on their hands and knees, and he's, showing how he's doing it to these other doctors who are standing around. So this was hardly any kind of any kind of great experience for them. This is a close-up of the statue of Anarcha. You can see there's this little rose in her womb, and that's what Michelle put there to symbolize the fact that this good operation did come out of it. It has saved and improved many, many lives, but he was getting the credit, and he's got this statue on the Capitol lawn. Well, so I started looking at that, and it got even more interesting because that statue apparently was not actually for Alabama. He was only in Montgomery for a while, but they apparently, South Carolina, which is where he was originally from, wanted to put that statue in Statuary Hall in the Capitol, but it got turned down. So he managed to get it put on the lawn of the Montgomery State Capitol. Well, okay, if you go to the next slide, yeah, okay, these are closer views of this very, very striking art. You can see there's a person there to the right of the picture who gives you an idea of the size of these statues. And on to the next slide. Here's a close-up of her. You can see she's made of metal. There's chains on her face. You'll find things like scissors and sharp, scary-looking things on the sculpture as well. And here's the thank you that she put there as as the acknowledgement that these girls have not, for so many years have not gotten for the part that they, without consent, contributed to the fact that we're now able to do that. And then I threw in a couple of pictures because there's also, she's made this into a garden, which is, if you go to the next slide, you can sit there and think about this, which I did, and seeing the sun come through there, and just the general sense of ability to reflect and be tranquil there is part of that experience. You're facing up to this, this sharp and ugly memory, but also given a place to stop and think about it. Yes. Then there's also this movement to get that statue moved from the Capitol grounds to this museum so that it would be in context. Now, I read an article about when they're talking about taking down the Confederate statues, what do you do with them? This is part of history, but we don't want to glorify it. And one of the best suggestions I saw was put it in a museum where you've got it in context. And that's what this would be. It would be a museum to, the beginnings of gynecology. He was the first one who really operated on women like this. But the fact that he couldn't have done it without these unnamed slave girls that, had to submit to this.
Okay, so I just have one other thing to talk to you about, and then we'll open it up for questions. So we did a Capitol tour after all of this civil rights stuff, which was very strange. after all we had learned about, we went to this Capitol tour, which felt to me like a real glorification of white supremacy and the Confederacy, which was such a whiplash from everything we had experienced. And we had this, the poor tour guide that we had, right? She had no idea what she was getting herself into when she was challenged a lot at every turn. But Dawn, you can. So throughout the Capitol, like this is a sign in front of the Senate chamber. It has been restored to when Southern delegates met to organize the Confederate States, right? So there's all this Confederate history inside the Capitol. And it really has left me with this question that Barb actually just posed too. How do you reflect the history without glorifying it? And it really felt like in the tour we were and the Capitol, the way they've set it up, really leans towards the glorification of the history rather than a reflection of the history. She did not mention the civil rights movement at all in our tour of the Capitol. And this was wild to me. So what does it look like he's holding if you just glance at it? A rifle, right? So they had these portraits of the last 4 governors. That is not a rifle, it's a tree. And he's holding onto the roots. And so we asked about it, and she's like, well, he's really considered himself to be a grassroots governor, and he wanted his official portrait to show his grassroots nature. Well, I'll tell you the gift of being on a tour where probably about a third of the people we were with were African American. They were like, here's the message we hear. We hear the lynching message in this. We hear this as a veiled threat. We feel like this holding of this tree has more meaning, right, than maybe those of us who were white would have put to it. I thought it was bizarre. I thought it was a rifle and then it's a tree, and it was very confusing. But anyway, so this is another plaque in there to commemorate the ordinance of secession withdrew Alabama from the United States, right? So we get outside. Okay, Dawn, you can keep going. To the steps, and we're like, okay, what about the civil rights history? And then she kind of waxes romantic about the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, and if you look straight down, there were thousands and thousands of people, and Martin Luther King addressed the crowd. And do you see that this gray rectangle painted in the street. That was where they pulled up a truck that had a trailer behind it, and Martin Luther King addressed the crowd from there because he was not allowed to set foot on the Capitol grounds. So we were like, huh. And that just seems so odd to me that they keep that rectangle painted there. But yeah, and then she said something about George Wallace was busy that day or something like that. I mean, I'm telling you, I was really shocked, and I shouldn't have been. It was one of those moments where it was like, oh, we are not in Seattle anymore, people. Yeah, so I just want to wrap up by saying I found this meme while I was on the trip. Sometimes you have to unlearn in order to change, and the un goes away. I felt like this trip, there was learning and unlearning to do, and it was really quite the gift to be able to experience it. So I'll open up just for a few more minutes for questions. You've all been very patient. If those of you on Zoom have questions, I think if you can put them in the chat, that would be great. But is there anyone here who has a question or want to hear more about something specific? Does it make you want to go? Yeah, Donna, go ahead. Uh-huh. Oh, thank you. Donna just thanked us for doing this and said we did a good job, which was lovely. I'm going to repeat your question so that it gets in the recording. Yeah.
Lynchings. What was the period of time that the lynchings were
began,
reported?
And others can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure from the period after Reconstruction, when, in Reconstruction there were, African Americans were kind of coming into power and they were part of official government, and then slammed back down again. And I think from about that time, so late 1800s through 1950, I think, is about the time frame for whom lynching. So it was like slavery, lynching / segregation. All of those things were part of the movement from slavery to mass incarceration. Right? Those were terror that the African American population experienced. That were all part of this kind of movement. Yeah. And lynchings did continue much longer than that, but we don't know a lot. Some of them too, but that in that time frame was kind of the height of lynchings. If we at the lynching memorial, most of the dates fall in those ranges. Yeah. Yeah, John.
Yeah, the transatlantic slavery. Sorry.
Uh-huh.
I heard that it stopped in 1846.
It stopped. Earlier than that. Yeah.
Which was no more slaves were brought from Africa.
Right. So there was the whole first movement of people who were kidnapped in Africa and brought here, and then and actually at the beginning of the Legacy Museum, they had the representation, and they showed Africa. They showed dots that represented slave ships, and you realize the United States was very late in that whole thing. The transatlantic slave trade went a lot to South America, to the Caribbean, before the United States was involved. And so the United States was actually involved time period-wise for a pretty short time. And then it was outlawed, but then it turned into, homegrown, right? So then there was this push for people to have babies, and because you need more, and especially then the demand in the South. And so I can't remember the difference in the numbers, but the amount of people who were enslaved by the end, way, way higher than the actual number of people who were brought here from Africa. It was an industry that was promoted once it was here. And so in some ways, we didn't need the transatlantic slave trade anymore. We had enough people here to then force procreation and keep going, right? So it lasted a lot longer than transatlantic slave trade. was outlawed. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we didn't talk about the bridge, and it's so funny because I think when we went on this trip, many of us thought that was going to be the highlight, right? That was going to be the pinnacle, was this march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And I think the worship experience that Jill talked about was really powerful. And then, I will speak only for myself, the march itself was like, it was so many people. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people. So you're in a giant crowd, kind of walking, and if you're as short as I am, you're like looking at people's backs, right? So but it was, I mean, in some ways it was really powerful. There was almost too many people for it to be powerful. This is how I felt about it. You know, coming back over, I did have a moment where I stopped right as we're cresting the pinnacle, and I was in my mind thinking about what those brave first marchers were looking at with the line of the Alabama State Police. But if you were craving kind of a meditative moment or a reflective moment, that wasn't the day to do it, really. It was really, I mean, I think it was a celebration for a lot of people who were there. There was a lot of beautiful things about it. There were a lot of Black organizations and people who obviously had prepared a long time for this moment, and so there was a lot of things that were very moving about it. But in terms of a personal highlight, that wasn't it for the trip. The other thing we did not talk about, oh, go ahead, Jim.
Quick comment on that. So when I got to the top of the bridge, I assumed, we haven't coordinated the slides, I had assumed there was going to be a picture of all the crowds there, so sorry about that. All you saw was the empty bridge. You got to the top, you were in this tremendous crowd, and so it felt like, okay, it might well have felt like that when they were actually doing the march. And so you come up to the top, and what did they see? They saw the Alabama troopers down at the bottom. Well, that wasn't what I saw. What I saw was the Alabama State troopers off to my right, just standing there, all of them Black. And it just was like, whoa, that wasn't what I expected, but that's the reality now.
The other thing we didn't touch on, which was so striking to me, was that Selma is an incredibly depressed city. It's lost half its population since the time of the march. There's almost nothing there. It's very boarded up. A lot of houses boarded up. There's really no place to stay in Selma, no place to eat in Selma. I think people who are doing civil rights trips come in because it's, 50 miles from Montgomery. They come in, they walk over the bridge, they leave. Selma, unlike Montgomery, hasn't been able to really capitalize for whatever reasons on this, and it may be proximity, and it may be there's just no money there. It is desperately poor. Desperately poor. So they had a tornado maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Nothing's been touched. I mean, there's houses with things ripped up. Nothing's been demolished. There is no rebuilding. It is really a sad place, and really could use an infusion of capital, I say. So, and I think that's not unlike a lot of other small towns in Alabama and in the South. But we really saw that there was a big contrast. I mean, Montgomery's the state capital, so there was that, but Montgomery also has some new life to it for whatever reason. So, so that was impactful. That kind of the storied history of Selma. The other thing is there's so many historic churches where important civil rights things happen that are in such disrepair. Brown Chapel, which is in Selma, which is where the Selma to Montgomery March started, we could not go in because of mold and termite damage. It's not safe to be in there. So, all of these wonderful, storied, old places of faith are going by the wayside. Yeah. Jan, go ahead. She's yelling.
Do you think that maybe this is pre-planned by state government to just let it
I think that's alluded to. That was alluded to, definitely. Funding. We had 2 tour guides. We had one in Montgomery who was from Montgomery, had grown up in Montgomery. And then our tour guide in Selma was a 15-year-old foot soldier on Bloody Sunday. So she told us wonderful stories about the preparation they went through in order to be ready for the march. She was a freshman in high school. And she alluded to that, right? That there's just that. And we've heard that a few times from people from the Black community, that they feel like some of what's happened has been intentional.
It sounds like there's been no state funding at all if you can't clean up after a hurricane.
Right. Yeah, no. I mean, it does feel like that in Selma for sure. Yeah. Yeah. And they're really trying to get this foot soldier museum happening in Selma and fundraising for that. It's tricky though. Yeah. Any other? Thanks for staying, everybody. You're probably hungry for lunch. Thanks, Zoomers. I see that I didn't see any questions from Zoom, so we'll wrap up now. But bless you all. Have a good rest of your Sunday. See you next Sunday.